Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Committee on Public Lectures at UCLA, I'm happy to welcome you to this symposium on Shakespeare, the Man and His Art. As you know, this is the final offering in a series of faculty lectures commemorating the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's birth that have been devoted to the subject, the worlds of William Shakespeare. This evening, we turn to the man himself. We're a little late, of course, for the birthday, which most people believe was on April the 23rd, last Thursday. But perhaps we can take some consolation from the fact that that date is just a guess, whereas yesterday, April the 26th, was the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's christening. And for that event, we have to support us the first of all historical references to William Shakespeare, the parish registers at Stratford. Tonight, however, we have chosen to turn our attention not to this auspicious event at the beginning of his career, but rather to concentrate on the achievements of the man that marked the latter end of his career. To borrow from Jake in As You Like It, we are ignoring the first of his 7 ages of man, that is, the infant mewling and puking in the nurse's arms. But let me hasten to add that we are also ignoring Jake 6th age, when his big manly voice, turning again toward childish treble, pipes and whistles in his sound. And we most certainly plan to ignore the 7th age, if it ever existed for Shakespeare, that age of second childishness and mere oblivion, sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. I suppose one could say, however, that we intend to concentrate on that 5th age, which Jake describes, the justice, fair round in belly with good cape and lined, with eyes severe and beard of formal cut, full of wise saws and modern instances. In other words, we propose to turn our attention tonight to those plays that mark the later years of Shakespeare's active career, roughly from King Lear in 1606 through the final tragedies, Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra, and Coriolanus, to that strange and fascinating group of so-called last plays or romances or tragicomedies such as Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest. We do this on the theory that Shakespeare's last works may tell us something about his final views on the art of the theater and on the human condition. The summation, in other words, of the man and the artist as he was. For this purpose, we are fortunate to have with us 4 men well qualified to comment on the varied aspects of Shakespeare's final achievement. First, then, may I introduce Dr. Hugh G. Dick, professor of English and chairman of the Department of English here at UCLA. He has published numerous books and articles on the literature of Elizabethan England and on the dramatic literature of the period in particular. As a nationally recognized authority on the literature and drama of the Renaissance, and as a very distinguished and popular teacher of Shakespeare on this campus, he is well equipped, I know, to comment on Shakespeare as a literary artist. Second, may I introduce Dr. Charles Tidd, professor of psychiatry in the School of Medicine at UCLA and chairman of the adult psychiatry division of that school. He is not only a practicing psychiatrist, but a scholar in the history of the treatment of mental disorders as well. More important for us, perhaps, he has long advocated and encouraged active exchanges of views between humanists and psychologists, between Shakespeareans and psychologists in particular. In this year, when psychologists are coming increasingly to realize the accuracy and the validity of Shakespeare's insights into human behavior, we are especially grateful for the participation of Dr. Tidd to comment on the human condition as Shakespeare finally saw it. Third, Mr. John Houseman perhaps needs no introduction in this hall to this group. As one of America's foremost exponents of Shakespeare on the stage, which of course is how Shakespeare really thought of himself after all, Mr. Houseman has been associated with the production of the plays from those exciting and revolutionary days of the Mercury Theater through his distinguished film production of Julius Caesar and his launching of the Shakespeare Theater at Stratford, Connecticut, down to today, to his production, now in preparation, of King Lear for presentation by the theater group on this campus this summer. His comments tonight on aspects of Shakespeare's final theatrical achievement will be those of a man who knows Shakespeare and who knows the theater. Finally, I introduce Dr. William Melnitz, Professor of Theater Arts and Dean of the School of Fine Arts here at UCLA. Since it is his own brilliant production of one of Shakespeare's last plays, The Winter's Tale, that we are displacing on this stage tonight, I suppose that he has more right to be here than any of the rest of us. But more than that, as the author of numerous books on the history of the theater and on the history of the stage in Shakespeare's time, he is well fitted to tell us something about Shakespeare as a man of the theater in the long view of history. Our plan of procedure this evening is to start with general statements by these four gentlemen on Shakespeare's final stages from the various points of view that these gentlemen represent. We hope that in the course of their remarks that they will inspire questions and inspire comments. If these questions occur to you, would you jot them down on the cards that have been handed to you? And when we have a short intermission following the general statements, those cards will be collected, and we, after the intermission then, will try to answer some of those questions, or at least to open them up for discussion. And now, may I ask then, as the first of our speakers tonight, Professor Dick, to comment on Shakespeare as a literary artist. Professor Dick.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips. I want to begin, if I may, with a plea for the essential unity of Shakespeare. Shakespeare as indivisible man. I think there's always a hazard in a symposium of this kind in somehow disintegrating the single creative artist. In other words, Dr. Tidd approaches Shakespeare, who was a man who probed the nature and the mysteries of man. I approach him as a literary artist. Mr. Houseman and Dean Melnitz approach him more from the standpoint of the theater. But I am not at all convinced that Shakespeare thought of his life in separable units of this kind. He was a man who lived an extraordinarily rich and abundant and productive creative life. He was, I think, a man who thought of himself as a poet, as a dedicated writer, who had made as his primary choice the medium of drama for his expression. And in Renaissance concepts of literature, it was indispensable for the poet to explore humankind. I plead then for the essential unity of Shakespeare. And one of the first bases of my plea is something which Shakespearean criticism and even Shakespearean scholarship, I think, has often overlooked. It's a little Latin tag prefixed to his first published work, the poem Venus and Adonis, that came out in the 1590s. It's a quotation from a Latin writer to whom Shakespeare was deeply attached, from whom he borrowed, and magnificently, in one of the great speeches of The Tempest. And so what you are hearing is not merely Ovid, the Roman poet, but Shakespeare citing Ovid. And here is what he says in translation. Let what is cheap excite the marvel of the crowd. For me may golden Apollo minister full cups from the Castalian mount. Translated, may the golden god of poetry and insight give me pure draughts of inspiration. And may I on my locks sustain the myrtle that fears the cold, and so be forever studied. Now, some of you may recall that the sonnets, too, give notable expression of the artist's power to transcend time, and Shakespeare's own deep, deep hopes that his words would speak to subsequent periods. And so, again, Shakespeare as dedicated artist and indivisible man. Now, in treating the four last plays, or the final phase of Shakespeare's production, we cannot, I think, view these works in total isolation. They are related to the whole corpus of what he wrote, from his earliest plays and poems to the final word. But I shall merely say that in the four periods of Shakespeare's creative life, as ordinarily distinguished, a period of apprenticeship, of revising old plays, a period of early maturity with the history plays, the golden comedies so-called, and the early tragedies such as Romeo and Juliet. Then that very amazing third period of his life, the period of those mordant, dark, bitter comedies and the great tragedies unparalleled. This third phase forms an immediate background out of which the plays like Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest arise. These last plays are variously labeled. Some scholars prefer to call them tragicomedy because they bring people near, in a way, the main characters near to death, but preserve them. Others prefer to speak of the dramatic romances, and actually I myself rather prefer the latter term. These late plays are looser in some ways in their plot structure than the great tragedies which had preceded. They're very capacious in regard to the amount of time covered, more than 16 years in The Winter's Tale, and they range movie-like and freely from place to place. But I think that the choice of form for these late plays was not accidental or adventitious, nor do I believe, as some scholars do, that it was dictated simply by immediate circumstances. That is, an audience somewhat wearied of tragedies, an audience somewhat more courtly in its taste, preferring greater amounts of masked music, dance, and spectacle. I don't believe either that it was fully due to the fact that Shakespeare's troupe, in which he was a shareholder, was at about this period contemplating lease or purchase of the Blackfriars in London, that is within the city proper, where plays of a more courtly type would be put on in an indoor theater. I myself have always felt that the primary basis of the form was artistic choice. I realize that this is perhaps something of a heresy, but these are plays, these 4 last plays, that have as leading themes a theme of wonder and of grace. Those 2 words are constantly in the mouths of the characters, and particularly in The Winter's Tale, and perhaps supremely in The Tempest. Wonder, not Hamlet's wonder, it harrows me with fear and wonder, but wonder more of the kind suggested by the very name of the heroine of The Tempest, Miranda, the wandering one, the girl who cries, "Oh, brave new world," that has such people in it. And for a play that is designed to create this sense of wonder, some expansion, I think, of time, some roominess and capaciousness of action are almost necessary. As for the theme of grace, I cannot really explore that. The theme is so pronounced that these plays have been subject in our own time and within the last decade, shall we say, to a series of theological interpretations which seem to me to go perhaps a little too far in trying to render explicit a Christian doctrine in dramatic terms. But nonetheless, the word and idea of grace are pervasive in these works. Now, a second body of thematic material is certainly the notion of redemption, reconciliation, and restoration. And it's these themes of renewal, of restoral, of a reassertion of a family, for example, that have, I think, reawakened interest in these plays which were at one time not so highly regarded as they are today. But even here, I insist, we have a kind of essential unity of Shakespeare, because these themes of reconciliation, restoration, are not unique to the last 4 plays. Indeed, as far as we know, one of Shakespeare's earliest unaided plays was that farce, The Comedy of Errors. And here, where in farce Shakespeare tries to outdo and indeed outdoes the Roman playwright Plautus, even here he inserts the frame of a somber story of a husband parted from his wife and children, and at the end of the play, restored. This theme is evident in the history plays, in the relationship, for example, between Prince Hal and the often distrusting king, his father. It's very deeply and most movingly involved in what I regard as the supreme tragedy of Shakespeare, the play of King Lear, where Lear must come to know himself before he can really know his children. The themes then of redemption, reconciliation, and restoration, which give these comedies, these last plays, these romances, a part of their tone and no small part of their theme, is, as I have said, pervasive. Now, if we regard the tragedies, as I think we can, as Shakespeare's mode of setting before us the catastrophe to which greatly talented people can bring themselves and others close to them, or perhaps in even wider circles, then the 4 last plays reassert, it seems to me, something other than the human capacity for catastrophe. They reassert certain living human values, powers of healing, powers of being cured, powers of self-awareness, and through self-awareness of coming to terms with other people. I close by quoting a man, a writer of whom I am very fond, Sir Philip Sidney, who wrote the great defense of imaginative literature in the English Renaissance. And the core of his defense of the imaginative writer was to say that he makes possible for us architectonicae, and I quote him, the knowledge of a man's self, not with the aim of well-doing and not of well-knowing only. The last plays, the last phase, I think, are part of Shakespeare's contribution to architectonicae and our knowledge of the living capacities of man.
Thank you, Mr. Dick. May I now ask Dr. Kidd for his comment, please?
Thank you, Dr. Phelps. In a recent issue of Saturday Review, a California school teacher reported the results of an examination after her pupils had seen a performance of Macbeth. In answer to the question, "Can you justify calling Shakespeare a supreme dramatist?" one student replied, "Yes. The way he casted characters, set scenes, and used tricky little expressions, he was second to none." It seemed to me that I would think from that answer that the student got the message. In thinking about the interest of the psychiatrist and psychoanalyst in Shakespeare and his work, one of the first things that comes to mind is the element of pleasure. For the psychiatrist, whose work is centered around the attempt to understand human behavior, to look into Shakespeare is like finding a textbook where the answers are easily available. It's like having someone readily at hand to do much of one's work. And the pleasure of finding such information in such interesting form, either to read or still better to watch in the theater, is tremendous. Now, while it is certainly true that in the work of the artist generally one finds deep understanding of the human personality, I think that there is no one who compares with Shakespeare in his penetrating insight into the most intricate wellsprings of thinking, feeling, and action. His perception of the unconscious, so clearly and frequently shown, is almost uncanny. And when one considers that he does this over such a wide range, including all sorts of people in every age group, the astonishment mounts. There is so much in his work that is of special interest to the psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. His use of puns, slips of the tongue, double meanings, and different levels of meaning are much like the material with which the physician deals every day. Then there is the rich imagery and symbolism, much of which is only barely perceptible or is subliminally perceived, but which produces a much more powerful reaction for just the reason that it isn't too obvious. On the other hand, he can use elements that are so obvious and blatant that they might appear to be artificial, but he uses them with such artistry and skill that they're completely convincing. His use of the spell in Midsummer Night's Dream is an example, or the use of the handkerchief in Othello. After considering his remarkable output, the plays, sonnets, and poems, the psychiatrist quite understandably might ask, who was the man who's done this? What kind of a person was he? Unfortunately, the psychiatrist is not able to answer these questions. He may speculate in a more or less interesting manner, but positive, definite answers are not forthcoming. And so it is with questions concerning how he was able to do what he did. In other words, what is genius? And the answer from the psychiatrist is, I don't know. I hope and assume that it is safe for me to speak for most psychiatrists and analysts on these questions. With reference to Freud, he certainly did not hesitate to say that he had little or nothing to offer which would throw much light on the creative process. And as for his own ideas concerning Shakespeare, it appears that he finally accepted the suggestion that the work was not done by Shakespeare, but by the Earl of Oxford, which I understand is extremely unlikely. Mr. Norman, may I have a little water, please? Mr. Norman M. Holland of Massachusetts Institute of Technology has written a paper in which he has collected the references to Shakespeare and Freud's work. There are something over 100, and I am indebted to Holland for much of the following information. One of the earliest references was in a letter to a friend in which Freud indicated that Shakespeare's play Hamlet had been of special importance to him, along with Sophocles' play, in working out the details of the Oedipus complex during the course of his own analysis. In his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, Freud pointed out that in Oedipus Rex, the incestuous wish is acted out, while in Hamlet it is repressed. In a paper in which he discusses character types, Freud uses the opening soliloquy to Richard III to illustrate a character type which Freud calls one of the exceptions. Such characters are people who feel that because something special has happened to them, such as having been born with a physical deformity, that they are not subject to the usual rules. They feel that they may operate as exceptions. And this is precisely what Shakespeare expresses in the soliloquy, and Freud uses it rather than citing a case history. In the same paper, Freud refers to Shakespeare as the greatest of all poets, and points out that Shakespeare does not reveal all the secret motives of his character, but only hints, so that the reader is obliged to fill in, and in so doing, tends to a stronger identification with the character. Other examples of the incredibly accurate description of character types of special psychiatric importance are seen in Measure for Measure and Coriolanus, as well as in many other plays. In Measure for Measure, the character of Angelo is easily seen as a compulsive personality with an anal sadistic background. In the character of Coriolanus, we find that Shakespeare has described what is known technically as a phallic character. In this, the emphasis is on the relationship between a strong, domineering mother and her son, who throughout his life continues to be dominated by the wishes of the mother. Dr. Phillips tells me that in Coriolanus, Shakespeare has given more information about the childhood and the mother-child relationship than in the case of any other character, and it's especially appropriate there. Along with such character studies, there are innumerable statements of special interest to the psychiatrist, those tricky little expressions that make him second to none. For the psychiatrist to read the line, "'Tis in ourselves that we are thus and thus," is to alert him. This is getting into an area in which the physician spends most of his time. The idea that an individual is principally motivated by forces within himself, although much about the whole matter may be unconscious, is a basic Freudian psychoanalytic concept. Another example of an especially appealing quotation may be found in the following lines. "It hath been taught us from the primal state that he which is was wished until he were." It would be difficult to find a more concise statement of another fundamental psychoanalytic cornerstone. The reference to the primal state certainly suggests to the analyst the idea of the early primitive elements of personality, intimately connected with the type of thinking which is characteristic of the unconscious. It is there that the wish is all-powerful and not amenable to change by logical, rational thought. Also, this is an example in which a statement contains more than one meaning. The wish may be related to the gleam in the parental eye which results in a new offspring, Or it may suggest the idea that parental wishes continue to affect the behavior of the child indefinitely. On still another level, it might very well convey the meaning that any individual is what he really wishes himself to be, even though that individual might not be consciously aware of the existence of the wish. To the psychiatrist, the description of Lear's behavior is almost a textbook description of the mechanism of regression as it occurs in old age. And probably the most frequently used reference is to Lady Macbeth's hand-washing to illustrate compulsive and symbolic activity. Now, I would like to illustrate Shakespeare's incredible ability to perceive and record some of the aspects of human behavior in which psychiatrists have even more professional interest. This might be done in many of the plays, but I've chosen one of the last four, The Winter's Tale. In this play, we have a detailed description of the outburst of a mental illness in which the individual is no longer able to assess reality correctly. His perceptions and thinking are distorted by emotional elements to the point that he loses contact with reality and he is no longer amenable to reason. The diagnosis is first that of a paranoid reaction, manifested chiefly by pathological jealousy and murderous impulses. Later, there is a change and one sees evidence of a depressive reaction. It's true that Shakespeare does not use our present-day psychiatric jargon, but his presentation is accurate and technically correct in an important way. One aspect of this correctness is seen in his presentation of overt and covert material. The open, overt picture of behavior is called the descriptive and is made up of the symptoms. Behind this are the covert or dynamic elements. In this picture of Leontes' behavior in Winter's Tale, the descriptive elements are portrayed, and along with them, the more subtle but all-important forces which produce the symptoms are indicated. The first open symptoms are shown in Leontes' thinking as expressed in an aside early in the first act. Before that, Leontes has been unable to get his friend Polixenes to prolong his visit, which has already lasted 9 months, and has asked his wife, Hermione, to try. She is successful, after which Leontes tells her that only once before has she spoken to better purpose, and that when she agreed to marry him. As Hermione gives Polixenes her hand, Leontes states in the aside, "Too hot, too hot, to mingle friendship for as mingling bloods. I have tremor cordis on me, my heart dances, but not for joy, not joy. This entertainment may a free face put on, derive a liberty from heartiness, from bounty, fertile bosom, and well become the agent. May, I grant. But to be paddling palms and pinching fingers, as now they are, and making practice smiles, as in a looking-glass, and then to sigh, as 'twere the mort of the dear. Well, that is entertainment my bosom likes not, nor my brows." Psychotic distortion is seen in this thinking. Before this, everything on the surface indicated that Leontes really wanted his friend Polixenes to stay on. But when his wife was unable to induce Polixenes to stay, after he had failed, suddenly these thoughts and feelings break through into consciousness. His heart palpitates, one of the first signs of anxiety. His wife and friend are, quotes, too close. The paranoid suspiciousness is expressed in the idea that what appears to be entirely open is really just a facade. Leontes sees the paddling palms and pinching fingers, the practiced smiles, the sighs. He misreads these and concludes that his wife is unfaithful to him. Soon after that, he tries to arrange for the murder of his longtime friend, Polixenes. Now this illustrates the descriptive aspect, the symptom of a paranoid delusion. Any psychiatrist would agree that this description is perfectly done. Not only are the words just right, but the exact timing, together with something else, makes the whole picture entirely convincing. The something else which Shakespeare supplies is given in earlier speeches when one of Leontes' lords, Camillo, talks to Polixenes' lord, Archidamus, about the childhoods of the two kings. They discuss the closeness of the relationship and how it has grown and developed. This same theme is brought up again after Polixenes has agreed to stay. Hermione questions Polixenes about the behavior of her husband and himself in childhood and youth. Polixenes emphasizes the innocence of their relationship, which opens up the question of what sinning they have done other than with their respective wives. At exactly this point, Leontes interrupts to ask whether or not Hermione has been able to get Polixenes to remain. As we know, she has, and soon after that we learn that Leontes suspects his wife and friend. Now, the significance of the discussion of the childhood and the lifelong friendships of the two men is related to what I said earlier about the dynamic elements underlying the overt symptoms. In the attempt to understand a symptom like the one shown by Leontes, one has to have information concerning the background of the patient. In the case of this particular symptom, a delusion concerning his wife's unfaithfulness with an old and close friend, psychoanalytic theory, based on many observations, indicates that it is probably connected with homosexual wishes which were unacceptable, in this case to Leontes. The specific point that I want to make here is that on some level, Shakespeare evidently understood this. I am by no means certain that he was consciously aware of such knowledge. He may or may not have been. In a similar manner, the playwright brings up another subject immediately after the eruption of psychotic thought. After the aside, Leontes turns to his son and asks, "Art thou my boy?" In the obscure speech which follows, Leontes approaches incoherence. It is the speech of a man who is struggling to maintain his mental balance, but losing. The thought of his wife's infidelity and the question of paternity is accompanied by feelings which destroy the possibility of rational thought. Later, when Hermione is delivered of a daughter, Leontes openly disowns the child, stating that she is the daughter of Polixenes. He then expresses his murderous intentions toward the infant. There isn't time enough to continue a detailed study. As indicated earlier, Leontes' condition later changes to one of deep guilt and depression, and finally, recovery. In conclusion, the psychiatrist turns to Shakespeare for pleasure and for information. He finds the artist with an incredible ability to observe and to record, accurately and honestly, the whole of the behavioral repertoire, including the irrational elements in human behavior. He is objective, but he uses appropriate feeling in a way which keeps his work from being case history material. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tidd. And now may we turn to a still different approach to Shakespeare with reference to the man and the artist. And may I call on Mr. Hausman?
In the course of the past 6 weeks that have marked this great orgy of emotion on the occasion of Shakespeare's 400th birthday, which is an extraordinarily interesting phenomenon and deserves an analysis that we don't have time for here tonight. I suspect that it's an enormously important phenomenon and that it far transcends such casual observations as life's issue with its superficial consideration of all the comic, serious, casual aspects of Shakespeare's life and all the jokes about the not writing the plays and so on. In spite of far transcending all of that, I suspect that the enormous need that our society has felt in this year 1964 to find some kind of comfort and some kind of hope and some kind of encouragement in the works of William Shakespeare is more than just a casual phenomenon. But that is certainly not the subject of this evening's talk. About this time in the evening, usually number 3 or 4 on these panels, I'm called upon after the philosophers and the historians and the psychologists have spoken to bring Shakespeare sort of back to earth and back to the realities of what he really was. The fact is that this genius is so transcending that out of his texts, rather more than out of his performed plays, a whole categories of people, as I say, historians, philosophers, aestheticians, all the branches of learning have turned to Shakespeare and derived enormous profit from him. But as a theatre man, I hasten at this stage of the evening to reclaim him and to remind you that he was a poet, but above everything he was a dramatist, and the line between those two was not as great then as it is today. I think there is a tendency on the part of the scholars to concentrate on Shakespeare and attribute things to Shakespeare which were really common to many of the other and, in the light of history, lesser writers of his time. The reference to puns tonight, other references really are equally applicable to his contemporaries, to the competitors on the theatrical marketplace of his time, with whom Shakespeare was competing on fairly equal terms. It is to be remembered that although he was the greatest of them and was recognized by some of his contemporaries as the greatest of them, he was just one of a number of people writing. 400 years have made it perfectly clear how great he was and how much greater than his contemporaries he was. But many of the things that are treated as significant in Shakespeare were really significant of the Elizabethan era and not exclusively of him. The point I'm trying to make is that Shakespeare was, above all, a practicing playwright, and therefore a man suffering from all the agonies and fears and uncertainties and humiliations that anyone who selects that most noble and most difficult of all writing forms goes through. I suspect myself that the great interest that we take today in the latter plays, beginning with King Lear and going right through the plays that have been mentioned here tonight, has to do with our identification with the problems and the attitude which Shakespeare had in those plays. And I think it's important to remember just what the physical situation of this, the material situation of this successful playwright was as he wrote these last plays. He had had his great successes. He had made his way up in a company in which he started as an apprentice. He had become their most valued playwright. He had become a rich man. He had become the mainstay of his company and, in a way, the mainstay of the contemporary theatre. Now, he wrote these plays, and there are certain characteristics in these plays that have puzzled a lot of scholars and seem to me easier to understand if one thinks for a moment and tries to recreate the theatrical situation and the professional situation in which he found himself. These plays have certain characteristics. Many of the world's greatest artists have, in their latter period, had a period that resembles somewhat what Shakespeare went through in these plays. These are commonplaces, the latter and obscure and generally unsuccessful in his day works of Beethoven, the latter painting of Rembrandt. These have characteristics that are not really entirely unlike those that color and characterize the last plays of Shakespeare. Shakespeare was a theatre man who, like all theatre men, certainly and without any question, lived in constant state and wrote and worked in a constant state of terror. Terror not quite as great perhaps as the unfortunate Broadway playwright or the latest writer of a television series or of a movie who is judged by the success of his latest work. I don't think the Elizabethan theatre was quite that enervated or quite that poor. But there's no question that he, like all playwrights, must have been desperately concerned with success, with achieving economic stability for himself and his company, success for himself in competition with the very many talented men who wrote in his time. These plays that we have mentioned show every evidence of a man who had made good. He had made a fortune, quite a substantial fortune by any standards. He had established a company. He had partially retired to the country. Undoubtedly, he wasn't rusticating, but he was no longer in the hellhole of a playwright who is being chivied by his company and his actors to grind out stuff for them. The plays have an evidence of a man who, not who doesn't give a damn, but a man who is much less immediately concerned with having a smash hit next Tuesday night. The plays have a kind of leisure about them, a kind of not indifference, but a kind of self-indulgence, which I think characterizes all these last plays, and it's a fortunate and wonderful thing for us that they do, because they permitted Shakespeare to move into certain fields which, as a successful playwright, as the hottest writer in town, he wasn't really able to indulge. The first evidence of this is clearly King Lear. King Lear could not have been written by a man who was desperately concerned with having a smash hit next Tuesday night. Hamlet, for all its greatness, has every evidence of a man who wants to write a terribly successful play, and it certainly has been the world's most successful play. Lear has certain indulgences, certain liberties which the playwright, which the poet asserts as his right, and which mark him as no longer the slave to the marketplace of the successful theatre. And this is even truer of the latter plays. It is extraordinarily true of The Tempest, which is really a self-indulgent in the highest sense, but a self-indulgent play, a man who had certain things to say about life, about the resolutions of life. I've argued with Dr. Melnitz, who has done a beautiful production. I haven't seen it, I'm seeing it tomorrow night, of Winter's Tale, but I hear nothing but good of it. I believe, and I was kidding in a way, but not entirely, I think that play has every evidence of having been put together by a very great man under special conditions. My own scenario for the writing of Winter's Tale is that a letter, that Shakespeare is in Stratford, and a letter arrives and says, this play of Bowman and Fletcher that we're doing is a dog, nobody is coming to it, and we're in trouble. We can't revive Hamlet once again. You've got to give us something new, or we're going to have to close. We're going to have to be dark. And so Shakespeare goes to his drawer and he pulls out an early play that it's a sketch of a play which he'd abandoned and which, as a matter of fact, had become Othello. Because nothing in the world will convince me that the first two acts of Winter's Tale are not sort of a partial cousin and a sketch for Othello. Then he also has a play about things that happen, a lyric play in which there are a lot of peasants and a fellow called Autolycus who's a thief, and there's a sort of a harvest festival, and he never quite was able to put that play into anything. And so he quickly, out of loyalty to his old friends in London, in Stratford, sat down and wrote this piece. The fact that he was one of the world's great geniuses also permitted him to write the character of Leontes with all the colorings and shadings which the professor has outlined for you. But that's because he was a very great man. I cannot believe that anybody would sit down from scratch and write Winter's Tale in that form. This makes it in a way all the more lovable, but it is a peculiar play in that sense. Certainly, The Tempest is not a play that Shakespeare would have written if he had had a hit to make. As You Like It is a play that he cooked up in 10 days because, again, they were in trouble, and this ridiculous piece is put together and which happens to contain about 5 of the very greatest speeches in the English dramatic language or the dramatic language of any country. But The Tempest is not that way. That's not thrown together. It's done as a self-indulgence, if you like, but it's done because a man in his personal life, a man in his personal philosophic life, emotional life, had something very important to say, and at that stage in his career, he could permit himself to say it. Cymbeline is a total mystery to me. I have seen it done as well as it could possibly be done, and after the first 2.5 acts, I have found it to be sheer, unadulterated nonsense, and I'm waiting for somebody to do it so that I can revise that opinion. But all I'm trying, and I've spoken too long already, is to raise in your minds the thought that the greatest playwright the world has ever known, in his mellower years, has the right to write plays that are not well made, that are not success pieces, but that happen to satisfy certain drives and certain curiosities of his own. And this, I believe, is what characterizes the latter plays, and even to a certain extent, although certainly it would be irreverent and insane to talk of Lear as anything but the greatest play that Shakespeare ever wrote or that any human being has ever written. But even in Lear, there is the determination of a man not to make a well-made play. There's a whole section in the middle of Lear which has nothing to do with good playwriting at all. It suddenly becomes a treatise on human weakness, on human frailty, on human wisdom, and then in due course the play proceeds and ends in its tragic and wonderful way. But from that play on, Shakespeare was permitting himself the luxury of being the very greatest writer that ever lived.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Hausman. And now that we have Shakespeare back down on the stage where he belongs, we'll have Mr. Melnitz perhaps keep him there.
Thank you. I am inclined to believe that such a letter was written to Shakespeare about the Winter's Tale. There would be another item in it. They would have said, and above all, we still have that tamed bear in the theater who was so terribly successful in our latest play, and if you possibly could include a part for the bear, please do that. But I am also inclined to agree with Aldous Huxley's statement that Shakespeare could mingle sublimity with pathos, bitterness with joy, and peace and love, intellectual subtlety with delirium and the cryptic utterances of inspired wisdom. And I think something of that divine mixture is visible and audible in those last plays. But I have been labeled an historian, and so I go back to history. The first great step forward for the Elizabethan drama was the designing and building of a theater, a unique theater called theater in 1576, and its companion, another theater, the Curtain, by another man the next year. The first one was built by James Burbage, the name of whom has made history later on because one of his sons became one of the greatest Shakespearean actors. These theaters, both theaters and the many that followed, gave the playwrights a form of stage that suited their current needs and led their successors to splendid new fecundity. A decade later came the first flowering in Christopher Marlowe's Tamburlaine and Dr. Faustus. Another 10 years brought the full fruit of Shakespeare's plays from Richard III and the Midsummer Night's Dream to Twelfth Night and Hamlet. No drama ever made such swift, extraordinary progress. Now, Mr. Hausmann already emphasized it, and I, in all humility, repeat, Shakespeare was not only a poet and dramatist, he was also an actor and a stage director. He staged his own plays, appeared in them, and as a stockholder, of course, shared in the profit and loss of two theaters. He went, in other words, as Mr. Hausmann said, through all the agony of a professional theater man. The Elizabethan age was passionately musical. Indeed, musical virtuosity at that time was probably, and I want to be corrected if I am wrong, more valuable a social asset than literary. And it is folly not to regard the texts primarily also as musical scores. The Elizabethans seem to have experimented vigorously with all possible forms of dialogue, rhyming verse, blank verse, the longer line, the shorter line, prose, like a painter choosing and mixing the colors until they found the exact answer to suit their various dramatic needs. The modern actor and director, for that matter, may be sometimes inhibited by an overabundance of naturalism, tends on the whole either to shirk these highly colored musical emotional climaxes, sometimes by destroying their true quality, and sometimes by simply cutting them, or to present them with a loud, empty, rhetorical flourish. It has been pointed out time and again that the Elizabethan audience was fascinated by processions and pantomime, by pageants, and the players catered to this taste. Shakespeare's Henry VIII made ample use of processional pantomime. Pericles contains several such dumb shows, and we must also not forget the dances, the choreography that were inserted in several of Shakespeare's plays, the dance of the Amazons, for instance, in Demon of Athens, and, of course, of the shepherds in The Winter's Tale. Now, for Elizabethan actors, the costumes were essential parts of their roles. Foreign observers were always impressed by the richness of their dress, One of the observers was Platter, and I don't know how my distinguished colleague feel about his authenticity on the subject, but he said, the comedians, I quote, are dressed most expensively and elegantly, for it is the custom in England that when noble lords or knights die, they leave almost their finest clothes to their servants, because it is not fitting to do so. They don't wear such clothes, but sell them to the comedians for a paltry price. Also, we cannot judge the authenticity of Platter's information. We know that on the Elizabethan stage, the actors were extremely close to the audience, and shabby costumes would have destroyed the illusion. I loved the statement of Mr. Gilgood several years ago, who said he wanted to stage a Shakespearean play on an empty stage, only with the most beautiful costumes. Now he had the opportunity to do it on an empty stage. But apparently something went wrong with the costume, because in Hamlet they were street clothes or even work clothes instead of those beautiful costumes he dreamed about. But this too is what every stage director experienced in his career. He has dreams, but not all his dreams materialize. Very few come true. Now, there is then a long gap between the most wonderful, flexible stage Shakespeare had and the proscenium stage that followed. And the history of Shakespearean staging is a long one, and I don't think I should go into it century by century, but I would like to retrace at least one century of time to mark the progress of a vital scenic reform. And that is the adapting of the modern playhouse, the proscenium stage, to the plays that Shakespeare wrote for a very different theater, the famous Globe Theater, which appears now in so many forms that, again, we probably have gone a little too far in duplicating the Globe. But this movement, I'm sorry to say, started in Germany and spread to England and America from there. The first man to try to reconstruct the theater of Shakespeare, the flexible, wonderfully fluid theater of Shakespeare, and make over our own stage so that it could serve the same purposes, was Ludwig Tieck, himself a playwright and poet. And after reading a builder's contract, and we all know that it was the Fortune contract, for an Elizabethan theater, he visited London in 1817, where he could see the proscenium doors and forestage, relics of Shakespeare's stage, in the theater of Windsor Castle and in Drury Lane and Covent Garden. In 1836, assisted by the architect Gottfried Semper, he made the reconstruction of the old Fortune Theater. Influenced by Tieck's studies and also by the old stage of the Oberammergau Passion Play, another German writer, great prose writer, Karl Immermann, created in the city of Düsseldorf, now the city of the millionaires, then a very interesting artistic city. He created there in 1840 the first stage deliberately designed to provide the fluidity of the Elizabethan theater. Immermann revived the proscenium doors and forestage and he provided an inner stage at the back and two arched entrances from distant places. On this stage, the whole of a Shakespearean drama could be played continuously without stage waits or transpositions of scenes. And for the first time in 200 years, Shakespeare's art form was then brought to life again. In 1843, when Tieck was 70 years old, he was asked by the King of Prussia to produce a Shakespeare play in the new palace of Potsdam. And for A Midsummer Night's Dream, Tieck used the usual side wings and provided 2 flights of steps to upper platforms as well as other stairs to a still higher level at the back, which could also be reached by off-stage steps like we assume was the case in the old Globe Theatre. Until the advent of the new stagecraft, that is in our own time, during the second decade of the 20th century, England did little toward creating a fitting stage for Shakespeare. About 1844, an actor-manager named Benjamin Webster, an ancestor of our Shakespearean director, Margaret Webster, who made a wonderful statement in the Show magazine saying that Shakespeare is indestructible, and she certainly has experience with it. That is very fine. This Webster was then the first one to do something in England, and the further history, of course, is known to you because then it was William Pohl and the Shakespeare Society that in 1881 took hold of it. This was the year when William Pohl produced the first quarto version of Hamlet in front of curtains in St. George's Hall, and from 1895 to 1905, his Elizabethan Stage Society gave a number of other classics on something approaching a Shakespearean stage. Now here in this country at Harvard University in 1904, Professor George Lyman Kittredge, great Shakespeare scholar, and George Pierce Baker erected a temporary Elizabethan stage within Sanders Theatre, where Johnston Forbes Robertson acted Hamlet, and where a few years later Maud Adams appeared in Twelfth Night. In 1921, Nugent Monk created in the Maramaket Theatre in Norwich an approximation of the Elizabethan stage. The Folger Library in Washington today contains a full-size but roofed in Shakespearean playhouse, and at the Chicago Centennial of 1933, Thomas Wood Stevens staged the plays of Shakespeare in replica of the Globe. San Diego has now a Globe designed by him, and in 1953, John Cranford Adams opened at Hofstra College in Hempstead, New York, a carefully detailed reproduction of Shakespeare's theater. So much about the real replica of the Globe Theatre. You all have seen them, you have liked them or disliked them. We don't have to discuss that. But our modern Shakespeare stage has gained tremendously by looking at this reconstruction. And what we are doing now, whether it is John Houseman in his early, wonderful, inspired Shakespeare productions, whether it is Guthrie in Minneapolis, whether it is on the festival in Stratford, Ontario, or in Stratford, Connecticut, we don't play Shakespeare any longer within proscenium walls. We have a new conception of staging Shakespeare, because more important than anything for Shakespeare is the word and the speed with which one scene moves to the next. In our modest way, we have tried it even here in Macao Hall with Winter's Tale. We have only one intermission there where it dramaturgically belongs, and up to that point, everything moves swiftly and is not in the way of the world. I think I am too long, but I get to an end by skipping over the notes. There are two phrases from Shakespeare which have been always before me when I started to direct a Shakespeare play. They were, "Lend me your ears," and "On your imaginary forces work." And these two phrases have influenced to a great extent my directorial technique, whether I did it in translation, and I must confess to you that I did more Shakespeare in translation than I did in the original, but it is a tremendously exciting thing to do it in the original, and even if you have brought up in another country where you really had it only in translation. But about that maybe later. John Gielgud, to mention him again, just published a very nice little book, Stage Directions, where he describes the ideal director for Shakespeare. Now, what he says here, do I have time?
I think we better
We better come to an end. So I don't think. Yeah, fine. But he, as every director, has been a dedicated director to Shakespeare. And as a matter of fact, I think directing Shakespeare is the proof to any director. I cannot help closing with a quotation of another great director who did really revolutionize in his time the way of Shakespearean production, and that is Reinhardt, who said in one of his few essays he wrote, "Shakespeare was the greatest, the one truly incomparable boon that the theater has had. He was poet, actor, and producer in one. He painted landscapes and fashioned architectural scenes with his words. In his plays, everything is bathed in music and flows into the dance. He stands nearest the creator. It is a wonderful, full-rounded world that he made, the earth with all its flowers, the sea with all its storms, the light of the sun, the moon, the stars, fire with all its terrors, and the air with all its spirits, and in between, human beings with all their passions, their humor and tragedy, beings of elemental grandeur, and at the same time, utter truth." Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Melnitz, and particularly for what I think was that very fine tribute that we heard at the end. Now, may I remind you that if you have questions that you wish to address to the panel or to any member of the panel, you write those on the cards that have been given to you and leave them with the ushers during the short intermission that we will now have. Then we will reassemble and discuss the questions that you have presented. Thank you. We have numerous and varied, and I think very interesting and suggestive questions. It's been rather difficult to choose since I don't think that you want to be here all evening. The one right on top of the pile that was in front of me here is a rather one that might challenge most of this group. Would a member of the panel care to comment on Shakespeare's personal family life? Would anyone? Mr. Dick, would you have anything to say?
No, I think really too little is known about this in detail. It seems to me we know a fair amount about his creative life, but relatively little about his personal life, and too little, in my view at any rate, to speak very meaningfully to that.
We do know, of course, that he left his wife his second best bed, and if you want to make something of that, I suppose you could. There is a question addressed to Dr. Dick. In The Winter's Tale, in his search for redemption and salvation, did not Shakespeare turn to the mystical or supernatural as rebirth of Hermione in marble form? Was not his quest for grace a request for godly assistance? Would you have any comment on that, Mr. Dick?
Yes, I would. It seems to me that the questioner asks a question to which a yes, but a modified yes, has to be given. In The Winter's Tale, there is certainly no doubt about, shall we say, supernatural intervention. And the prime example of that is, of course, the words of the oracle, which are thematic. This is not derived from man, but from apparently a voice out of the unknown, a voice out of the void, and without the proclamation of the oracle, the particular ending of the play would not be possible. But I think one should not lose sight of the fact that the resolutions and reconciliations at the end are equally made possible by human fidelity, by human kindness, and by other acts, such as the act of repentance of Leontes. In short, I don't think it's an either-or thing, but I do believe that Shakespeare is giving us both elements as significant motivation for the conclusion of the play. I said I objected to overly theological interpretations, and what I meant by that was attempts to identify certain characters, as some corpus of modern criticism tends to do, with Christ crucified and with highly specific theological concepts. I'm very distrustful of that, because certainly no small part of the religious background of The Winter's Tale, whether it's for artistic verisimilitude or for other reasons, refers to a polytheistic world. It's not the God or God, it's the gods, the heavens, that proclaim themselves through the oracle. Now, if you want to attach particular Christian meanings to that, I see no objection, as long as you don't overdo it and make it rigid and doctrinaire.
Thank you, Mr. Dick. There is a question addressed to Mr. Hausman. What is wrong with Troilus and Cressida? And could it not be made, like Measure for Measure, a great comic success? Would you care to comment, Mr.
Answer in 3 words. First question, nothing. Wonderful play, nothing wrong with it. Second question, it's not really to the same, I am sort of notorious for having pushed the comedy in Measure for Measure further than almost any contemporary director. I don't think Troilus and Cressida is nearly as comic a play. I think it's a terrifying, tragic and awful and bitter and wonderful play, and I would love to do it someday. Its record is one of almost unqualified failure every time it's been done.
Thank you. Dr. Tidd, the question is asked, was Leontes' recovery in The Winter's Tale as true to fact as the portrayal of his illness?
The answer is yes, but with some qualification. And we're dealing with a dramatic production, and certainly the dramatist has the right to twist things as he sees it necessary. Actually, as you know, in this short presentation I made, I opened just the beginning of the illness and showed something of the understanding that I believe Shakespeare had of how the illness started and what was behind it. That this should rather suddenly change into a depression which would last a long time, as indicated in the play, is something that is seen quite frequently, certainly not infrequently. And it often is followed by recovery. Now, as I say, I think it suits the dramatic needs of the play to have him recover as he did. But I think it's not too far out of line. I just can't help but believe that Shakespeare had actually seen illnesses of this sort, was smart enough to observe them carefully and accurately, and then when he needed them, use them.
I wonder if I could be permitted to inject a question here. I suppose it's not fair, but it occurs to me as we hear Mr. Dick on this, the conclusion of Winter's Tale, and Dr. Tidd, I recall Paulina's great line just before the statue begins to move. And it's very impressive in your production, Mr. Milne. It's that very tense moment. And just at that moment of transformation, Paulina says, it is required you do awake your faith. Now, to whom does she say this? Is this a man of the theater turning to the audience through Paulina and saying, now you'd better believe this, suspend your disbelief? Does this have theological significance? Does it have psychological significance? I've always been fascinated by the line, and I think it ties into this question we've been discussing.
I played it for sheer magic, really, to do it in the real thrilling fairy tale atmosphere of that act. And of course, I addressed it to the crowd on stage, that everyone who was, and I hope it came out, that everyone was terribly excited about what was happening there. And the words, of course, are indicative of religious meaning, but there is a little more to it, I think, and there's a theatricality in that.
Could it,
Mr. Dick,
I
yes,
was just
Dr.
going to
Tidd.
say, could the word there have the meaning of hope?
Of hope?
Yes.
Do
He
you
had
think
shown
so,
Leontes had shown so obviously that he hoped that it really were alive, that the statue were. I don't
Then
know.
it would be addressed to Leontes only?
No, not necessarily.
No, I think it should be addressed to the crowd.
Do you have any view on that, Mr.
No,
Dick?
I would think it's addressed to both Leontes and all on stage,
Yeah.
because throughout the play, Paulina has been the plain speaker, the voice
Yes.
of health, resolute, courageous, blunt even by times. And I think this is another, so to speak, of the positive utterances that she has to give to the hero and to all the beholders, including the audience in the theater.
Dr. Tidd, may I say, hasn't the element of time, these 16 years, something to do with the healing process?
Oh, yes.
Couldn't that be even in a contemporary case history?
Oh, absolutely. I mentioned
16 years is a
Didn't I?
long
Yes.
time to recover.
Of course, while we're on this subject, you know, one of the most cautious of all Shakespearean scholars, Sir Edmund Chambers, posited a nervous breakdown for Shakespeare following the period of the great tragedies and with some incapacity to finish that most man-hating of all plays, Timon of Athens. This is, however, pure speculation.
There have been psychiatrists and analysts who've taken this up and continued the speculation, but so far as I know, it continues simply to be speculation.
Yes.
There is a question, Dean Melnitz, addressed to you that I think might give us some basis for discussion. Were you perhaps saying that the proscenium-type theater does have some advantages over the globe?
A modified proscenium theater has certainly certain advantages. I personally think, but I have been brought up in the tradition of the most imaginative and wonderful Shakespearean productions. So I am always, for instance, Granville Bacchus, and these productions, I left a great impress on me, and I would say that the Globe Theatre used too frequently becomes a little monotonous. And I am very happy that the latest ventures, whether that is in Stratford, Ontario, or in Stratford, Connecticut, or in Minneapolis, where I will spend my summer this year at the Guthrie Theatre, did not really reconstruct a globe, but build a wonderful, flexible stage that could offer all the advantages of the globe, that is fluidity and speed, without having always the monotony of the replica before your eyes.
I've seen 3 replicas, and they have never worked.
You see, I'm glad you say that, John.
Could you wait?
Because you see, you know exactly where everyone will enter, where everyone will exit. The pictorial beauty, which I think is not against Shakespeare if you use it moderately. As soon as a naturalistic stage it takes away from Shakespeare the magic of the word, his painting with words, then of course this is bad. But a space stage where everything is really possible and not really limited by those historical reconstruction, I think is preferable.
Well, also the reconstructions always take place under circumstances which do not resemble the original location,
That's true, yeah.
which has a lot to do with it. Also, no archaeological reconstruction ever works, because it just isn't in the cards that a physical reproduction under circumstances quite different from the original and deriving not as an organic growth from the inn-yard, but recreated by a lot of foundation money, that these aren't going to work.
I agree with you.
Mr. Hausman, there is a question addressed to you, which I think, part of which I think you might like to answer. So-called revivals or renewed popularity of certain classics are sometimes due to being in tune with the times rather than simply appreciation of as classics. Is there in King Lear and its tragic development a parallel to the nihilistic outlook of today? P.S. When does King Lear open?
Well, that's a very practical and worthwhile question, especially the last part of it. King Lear opens on the campus here in Schoenberg Hall on the 6th of June and plays for 3.5 weeks, and then it lays off a week while we prepare it for the outdoor theater, the Pilgrimage Theater, which is not a very large outdoor theater. It's quite an intimate outdoor theater, but it's still more than double the capacity of Schoenberg, and we opened there on July 10th. And it seems to me almost mandatory that you should all go to both. About Lear, yes, of course that's true. The fact is that Lear was performed, but always rather reluctantly performed and with considerable lack of success and very little pleasure derived from it during the 19th century. That's when the great canard rose that this was a play for the library and not for the stage. The truth is that to the 19th century and even to the late 18th century, Lear must have been a very repulsive play. Certainly the Victorian era believed in perpetual progress. They believed that the millennium was just over the edge of the hill, and they believed this quite sincerely and passionately. Everything they did and thought was based on that conviction. And to them, Lear must have been really quite repulsive, and the pessimism of Lear must have been incomprehensible and loathsome. It is only in our time, when humanity and mankind has suddenly been confronted with the immediate prospect of annihilation, when the human race has been called upon to examine its identity and to examine its place in the world, that Lear suddenly begins to make fantastic and terribly immediate and exhilarating and painful sense. Hamlet, which is of course the perpetual and perennial success, still succeeds, as it does in New York at this moment, but the fact is that nobody is terribly interested in the dilemma of Hamlet. For some strange reason, this very personal dilemma with its moral implications and the question of action, unlike Julius Caesar, which concerns assassination, but the assassination of a political menace, of a dictator, and what are the human consequences should you resort to bloodshed or not. This is a play that makes enormous sense in our time. Hamlet is still the greatest, contains some of the greatest thinking and poetry of any of Shakespeare's plays or any play ever written. But strangely enough, I've watched it and it does not interest audiences very much. Lear has a fantastic effect on audiences. This is a play that never succeeded. This is a play that Henry Irving, the infallible Henry Irving, lost a fortune. He lost £40,000. It practically put him out of business. Today, beginning about the middle 40s in England and then a little later here, this play drives people to tears. They sit there with their cheeks wet with tears, and at the end, they won't leave the theater. And some of the productions of Lear have been very fine. But this is more than that. This is simply a recognition of something terribly immediate and terribly close to any thinking or feeling person in the audience.
Dr. Dick or Dr. Tidd, would you have anything that you would want to add to that on the relativeness, the relevance of Lear today?
I don't think so.
No, I think that Mr. Hausman has said what I would certainly say.
There is a question here for you, Professor Dick, that I think does raise somewhat related issues that bother many people. To this effect, passages and descriptions such as the 7 Ages of Man speech appear to me very shallow and not becoming to Shakespeare's genius. Am I justified in my opinion?
That's an extremely good question, I think. Mr. Phillips, of course, was using this in his introduction and in context. Excuse me. That is to say, I don't think we should take these speeches, however repeated they are, in isolation outside the dramatic context. That speech is uttered in As You Like It by the melancholy Jaques, who is somewhat shallow and somewhat superficial and somewhat jaundiced. And this is part of the evidence of his character. He's a man who willfully adopts a somewhat persistently satiric point of view toward life and toward the other characters. I think if you sense a little shallowness in it, you sense something that Shakespeare put in it. In dramatic context, in other words, it suits the character, it suits the situation, and it suits the play. It shouldn't be regarded as a speech, so to speak, all by itself.
Thank you, Dr. Dick. Dr. Tidd, do you have a
Yes, first I would like to thank
final?
I would like to thank the people who addressed questions to me, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to let most of them down. I find that the questions are, for the most part, beyond me. For example, please explain Othello's personality problem that would lead him to murder his wife on such flimsy evidence of his wife's infidelity. Now, I didn't find this amusing. I found it a very good question. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to save the question and try to work on it. And maybe I'll write a paper on it. But it's not something that I could answer just offhand. Perhaps some of my colleagues could.
I think, Dr. Tidd, we'll leave that for you to work on. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, since our time has come to a close, I would like to express to the members of this panel the appreciation of the University Committee on Public Lectures for their participation, and I should like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your cooperation and your attendance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.